Some of you remember when Andrew came to Philip and said, I found a Messiah. And Jesus replied, Philip's reply was, what good can come out of Nazareth? Now that was the original title of this talk, but it was changed by Lindsay and by Greg Pritchard to this one. So if this sounds a bit presumptuous, don't blame me, all right? What good can come out of Nazareth? And I thought I'll share some thoughts that what's happening in the majority world. This, what I'm presenting, is not a finished paper. It's an ongoing process. It probably cannot be finished even in the next few decades, but we will see it unfolding. So if there are mistakes here, feel free to challenge me. I'm open to it, okay? I am not very good at presenting more academic papers extemporarily. So although I preach extemporarily, so I hope you do not mind if I just read from my paper. The title of this presentation would have been a non-question had it been asked as recent as the middle of the 20th century. The churches in the non-Western world, or majority world, were by and large still under Western tutelage. The big fear in Africa in the middle of the century, at the end of the colonial era, was that Islam would sweep across the continent. The struggling Chinese church was just entering the darkest hour of its modern history. In South Asia, Christians were a tiny, often despised minority in the midst of hundreds of millions of Hindus and Muslims, many of them very militant. Yet, just in 70 years, the percentage of Christians in the majority world in just 100 years has gone from 17% to over 65%. That is the picture. So today, the center of gravity of the church has moved out of the West into the majority world. With this shift, some of the relative strengths and weaknesses of Western Christianity versus that in the majority world have become increasingly clear. It is against this background that I make my presentation, not as a teacher, because Christianity in the majority world are still struggling through a lot of issues, but as a fellow pilgrim and learner. Indeed, as some of the issues raised, churches in the majority world, as I say, are still struggling for answers. I would like to highlight 6 areas this afternoon, but other areas which we don't have time to cover. I want to begin by talking about the supernatural dimension and the need to recover it. Many of you heard the story I shared in my own country on Sunday night. Or was it Saturday night? Recovering the supernatural dimension, in referring to the advance of the gospel in his work, Paul speaks of what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, and by the power of the Spirit of God. Over the past 100 years or so, the rapid growth of the churches in the majority world has been largely driven by the same signs and wonders that Paul speaks of. This includes deliverance from demonic powers and healing, miracles and prophecies, dreams and visions, and the like. It should be emphasized, and I want to emphasize this point very strongly. Many people think that, this is an expansion of Pentecostalism which flow out of Azusa Street in California. That is not the case, all right? In many cases, in fact, most cases, it was simply that indigenous Christians got the Bible, got the message, read it, the Holy Spirit comes, and these things happen. As in the story I told you on Saturday night. A comprehensive and careful examination of the records will bear this out again and again, as shown by scholars like Philip Jenkins. This is true of the growth of many grassroots churches in the Indian subcontinent, the growth of Christianity in Africa, especially among the African initiated churches, AICs, the breakthrough among tribal groups all over the majority world, the Chinese revival of the last 60 years, the historically unprecedented and ongoing breakthroughs among Muslim peoples all over the Islamic world today, and many other examples as well. A very interesting example is the Korean pastor Kim Ik-doo, who was effective especially in the 1920s. The Korean Presbyterian Church position was officially on signs and wonders. In the present age, the authority to perform miracles is suspended. Now, some of you know the B.B. Warfield's writings on cessationism. It obviously came out of the American missionaries. But the impact of Kim's healing ministry was such that it brought about a fundamental shift in the thinking and recognition within the church that God continues to work miracles in the present age. In direct contrast, one observer of Brazil's emerging churches said, quote, again about Presbyterians, excuse me if you are Presbyterian. Most Presbyterians have a God that's so great, so big, that they can't even talk to him openly because he's so far away. The Pentecostals groups have the kind of God that will solve my problem today and tomorrow. Now, this is just an observation at a ground level. Under the influence of the Enlightenment, Western Christianity in the modern era has either rejected the supernatural as outdated superstition, as in the case of the liberal church, or treated the miraculous as something that happens in the past but no longer today. Consequently, much of the Western church has failed to address this whole subject adequately. It has blinded the church to the power of the Holy Spirit and his signs and wonders, as well as to the reality of demonic activity in the world today. The result, as Fuller Professor Charles Kraft describes it, quote, Enlightenment Christianity is powerless. Herein lies a major flaw in Western Christianity, its captivity to an anti-supernaturalistic Enlightenment worldview. Could this blindness to the spiritual realm be one key reason for the decline of Western Christianity, especially in a time when occult practices of all kinds, including Satan worship, is proliferating throughout the world? If you read BBC News, right now, one of the largest Satanist meetings is taking place in downtown Boston. Right now. Second point, managerial missiology versus dependence on the Spirit. The Latin American Samuel Escobar has critiqued a trend within evangelical missiology in the later part of the 20th century, associated especially with the Church Grove School and movements like AD 2000 and beyond. He calls this managerial missiology, or missions by management, and describes it, quote, an effort to reduce Christian missions to a manageable enterprise. To achieve this, reality is simplified into an understandable picture. Missionary action is thus reduced to a linear task that is unfolded into logical steps to be followed in a process of management by objective. You think of the assembly line, how you put a car together. That's the way we think. We think of that, management by process, missions by management. Thus, for example, mission goals are quantified by a number of converts won or churches planted, and strategic plans are laid to bring about the desired results. The whole exercise is based on secular planning approaches built on the scientific method which produced our technological age. I would like to expand Escobar's critique a little bit more. I think the managerial missiology he describes is part of a much wider problem with the modern church. Is it not the case that much of our thinking has succumbed to modernity's scientific technological approach to doing church and mission? Do not most of us assume that if only we have sufficient resources, such as suitably trained personnel, money, proper strategic planning, and sound management, the church will invariably grow and our mission goals achievable without fail within our human lifetime? In other words, ministry and missions can be done primarily by sound management techniques, good strategic planning, in a manner that is no different from other human enterprises like selling Coca-Cola. Now, ultimately, oh, by the way, that was an exact quote given by one mission leader after he attended one Lausanne meeting. He said, what's the difference between church evangelism and selling Coca-Cola? He came out of the meeting. Ultimately, There are two major problems with this approach. First is that reducing our mission goals primarily to quantitative measures of how many converts are made and churches planted fall short of Christ's command to make disciples. As one writer puts it, when we aim only at what we can measure, we ignore the most important goals of character, discipleship, and holiness, which we cannot predict or quantify without falling into legalism. Lukewarm churches are the result of this assembly line approach. The second problem is that both the New Testament and church history have demonstrated again and again that the gospel never advanced by mere human efforts alone. Rather, what we find is that revivals and major advances of the church are invariably the result of two intertwining forces at work. On the divine side, we see the initiative and the power of the Holy Spirit. And on the human side, we see less tangible factors such as radical holiness, prevailing prayer, obedience, sacrifice. These, and not human management and strategic planning, are foundational. The wind blows where it wishes, so it is with everyone born of the Spirit. John chapter 3, verse 8. In the past 100 years or so, we have seen this repeatedly in mission advances in the majority world. Those of you who are familiar with Africa, you can think of people like Prophet Harris or Simon Kimbangu in Congo in the first part of the 20th century. You think of the phenomenal growth of Pentecostalism in Latin America in recent decades. But one of the best illustrations comes from Asia, from the ongoing Chinese revival. The most notable evangelist and revivalist of the first half of the 20th century in China was a man by the name of John Sung, a brilliant American-trained PhD. On returning to China in 1927, exactly 120 years after Robert Morrison first came to China, he found that the Protestant churches were not growing or growing only slowly. Despite the fact that the missionaries had literally brought in thousands of missionaries, brought in tons of money, built the best schools, best orphanages, best hospitals, best universities. And so he went to God and says, God, what's the problem? Because God says very simple. The missionaries brings all these things. They want to keep in control. They are dependent on these things for the growth of the church. The same problem with the Chinese pastors. They are not looking to me. They're always looking to the missionaries for their salaries. And then he said something. And this was said in about 1940, when China was almost being overrun by the Japanese during the Second World War. He said, a day is coming when God is going to bring a great revival. But first, all the missionaries must leave. It's all found in his diaries and also in the biography of a close friend of his. So it's not something that said afterward it happened. 1940, he died in 1944. The war ended 55. 49, the communists took over. By 51, almost every missionary had gone. The church was under intense persecution. Everything that the missionaries brought were taken away, including churches, buildings, closed up. Hundreds, if not thousands, of pastors and leaders were thrown into jail. And with nothing but God, when everybody thought that the church had died, the revival came. Son is here, comes from a Chinese church. You can talk to him later, all right? All right. I wanted to tell you the other side, which is not in my paper. And this I say with great pain. Do you know what happened in India? In India, in Indian subcontinent, they did exactly the same thing. Brought in thousands of missionaries, brought tons of money, best schools, best orphanages, best universities, best hospitals. You talk to people who know the Indian scene well. They say the bishops today spend half their time in the law courts fighting over property. Where the church is growing, and just a year ago, the police arrested the head of the Church of North India, who was holding hundreds of thousands of US dollars in his home and gold bars. And this is the corruption that's set in. Where the church is growing in India is at the grassroots. People not affected by these mainline denominations. Just imagine what would have happened if the communists had not taken over in China. Unfortunately, many of us in the majority world have not learned this vital lesson well. Instead, the tendency for many of us is to draw on Western approaches based on managerial missiology, modeled and taught by our Western teachers. I say this without anger or bitterness. Please forgive me if it comes across like that. Without critically reflecting on them in light of scriptural teaching and the Spirit's leading. For example, just think of the 2,000 over plans that some of you may have been participating, drawn up for 82,000 and beyond. And all these plans have not produced much. Think of human resources, good management, strategic planning, all have their proper place in the ministry and mission of the church. But for the gospel to advance, ultimately, our dependence has to be on God and on Him alone. How can this truth reshape and drive our ministry and mission in the coming years? The third issue is the confidence in the gospel of Christ, or to use the word of Dr. Julian how do you pronounce it, Lindsay? Gashagan. He said, how can we present the good news so that people know that we have the confidence that we are really presenting good news to our culture. Many in the West today consider Christianity outdated, stale, and irrelevant. This has contributed to a decline and loss of vitality in Western Christianity. This loss is also in part due to the inner spiritual and moral weakness of the church. Unfortunately, this has been further aggravated by the revelations of widespread sexual abuse in the Catholic Church and similar reports of sexual and financial scandals and power abuse in the mega churches and among TV evangelists. But the loss of vitality is also the result of the pressures on the churches in the West from the increasingly militant secularism rooted in modernity and postmodernity. In much of public life in the West, there's a prevailing hostility, both subtle and open, towards any Christian point of view. For example, if a Christian stands up and talks about Christian family values, a Christian leader, he's hammered straight away. I still remember in Britain, when Bishop Michael Nasir Ali said publicly, he says, those couples want to marry but they don't want children are rather selfish. The whole press came up hard on him. And that's the situation. One of the clearest examples was this. In Europe, one of the clearest examples of this public hostility towards Christianity was seen in the debate over the new EU constitution in 2004. The row was over whether Christianity should be cited as one of the sources of European civilization. Many intellectuals and academics argued against it because they treated Christianity as not relevant to public life, but not only as not relevant to public life, but as an obstacle to the evolution of a secular Europe. Against all historical evidence, militant secularists in a post-Christian Europe seem bent on denying that Christianity make any significant contribution to the well-being of European society. All these have contributed to a loss of confidence in the gospel as a power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. In the Western Church, this is the most clearly seen in the liberal wing of the church, which has basically abandoned mission on the grounds that it's religiously imperialistic and destroyed the converts' cultures. They have affirmed religious pluralism in contrast to the uniqueness of Christ, and they have championed the rejection of biblical ethics, especially over abortion, marriage and divorce, and LGBT issues. But this loss of confidence in the gospel and biblical distinctive is now beginning to be seen, unfortunately, among many who identify themselves as evangelicals. For example, some Western evangelicals were unwilling to take a firm stand on the issue of the LGBT issues. But the problem actually runs deeper. Many Western evangelicals are reluctant, and I say this very carefully because just in case some of you yourself may be caught in it, are reluctant to accept the Bible's clear teaching on marriage and divorce and remarriage. And yet they want to draw a line on the LGBT issue. You cannot have the cake and eat it, as they say. This loss of confidence in the gospel, however, is not shared by Christians in the majority world. To begin with, in many societies and cultures in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and MENA, Middle East and North Africa, the encounter with Christ is recent, and the experience of its efficacy and power is fresh and liberating. In Asia itself, for example, think of the tens of millions that have been set free from the age-old fear of demonic spirits and demonic powers and evil spirits. Think of the millions of Dalits in India who have been lifted out from cultural and social-political oppression after thousands of years of existence as a subhuman underclass. Or consider how many intellectuals in China, both Christian and non-Christian, who he says that the evidence in history is that the gospel of Christ offers the only adequate basis for building a new society based on genuine freedom, democracy, justice, and equity. Although this position has been rejected by many secularists, it has nevertheless been argued by many Christian thinkers. Of particular interest today is the fact that a person like Tom Holland in Britain, who is actually a lapsed Christian, who's arguing exactly that. He writes in a recent article, he's a British public intellectual, he argued along similar lines in his latest writings. And he says, noting that much of what is good and noble in Western culture owes its roots to Christianity. In his writing as a lapsed Christian, he concludes a recent article in a New Statesman as follows. He says, in my morals and ethics, I've learned to accept that I'm not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian, from somebody who is not a Christian. The second point to note is that the beliefs shaped by modernity and modernity that underlie militant secularism in the West today are not shared by the cultures and societies in the majority world. Simply because we, coming from the majority world, are not the children of the Enlightenment. Certainly much of the majority world has been hit by the surface impact of secularism through globalization. But few societies in the majority world share the modern idea that there's only truth in logic and science, not in religion and ethics. Or, going further, the postmodern view that there's no such thing as truth because everything is a matter of perspective. That being the case, modernity and postmodernity must be recognized for what they are, not concepts that are universally true, valid, and applicable everywhere, but narrowly contextual and applicable only a small period of human history. Why then should Western Christians be awed and accord them the respect which secularism gives it? Many Christians in majority who are driven by a vision of a new world founded on the gospel of Christ, which holds promise both now and eternity. For now and then. With them, there's a conviction and an excitement over the saving power of the gospel. They find it rationally coherent, intuitively true, and satisfying, and most of all, empirically, they've seen its power transforming lives and communities. If I may borrow from Julia from last night, they found that emotionally it's fulfilling, the gospel. Intellectual is inspiring. Morally is good and beautiful. And that's what's found in the majority world. So I submit that this sense of the freshness and confidence in the gospel should be a source of encouragement and challenge and strength to many Christians in the West who are seriously committed to biblical authority. And to give you strength to make a stand against a powerful and militant secularism threatening to overcome the church there. I move on to my fourth point, mission and the Western guilt complex. In the late 1940s and to the 1960s, the late 1940s to 1960s were the heyday of the anti-colonial movement, especially in relation to missions. Beginning in the 1960s, the liberal wing of the church began calling for what he called a moratorium on or withdrawal of missionaries. Western missions were perceived to be a new form of imperialism. The term used was religious imperialism. And thus missionaries were told to go home so that the churches in the majority world can find their own identities. The whole idea of preaching the gospel and converting others to Christianity was attacked and derogated as religious imperialism. Furthermore, secular anthropologists often accuse missionaries of destroying the cultures of the indigenous people because the process of conversion also took the converts out of their former cultures. All this gave rise to a pervasive Western guilt complex over the whole missionary enterprise, as well as over other matters. Addressing this phenomenon head-on, the late African scholar and Yale professor Lamin Sanneh, a Christian from Gambia, converted from Muslim background, demonstrated cogently that the accusation of missionaries being culture destroyers did not find support on the ground. Yeah, they make mistakes in the past, there's no denial. But by and large, what he asserted was this. In fact, through the translation of the Bible into the indigenous language, missionaries actually helped to preserve many languages and cultures from extinction. In other words, without denying that mistakes have been made, in many parts of the majority world, missionaries were in fact those who preserve cultures and not who destroy cultures. More recent studies have gone even further to vindicate the whole modern missionary enterprise as a major factor in bringing social and material advancement to many parts of the majority world. This has been demonstrated by the social scientist Robert Woodbury, the son of Dudley Woodbury, for those of you who know the names, in a piece of groundbreaking and prize-winning research published in the prestigious American Political Science Review. I understand it's one of the top journals. He shows that the Protestant missionaries in the past 100 and more years made major contributions to the social, political, and economic advances wherever they have labored. Quote, areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence in the past are on the average more economically developed today, with comparatively better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainments, especially for women, and more robust memberships in the NGOs. In fact, missionaries contributed greatly to the spread of stable democracies around the world. He argues, quote again, they were crucial catalysts initiating the development and spread of religious liberty, mass education, mass printing, newspapers, voluntary organizations, and colonial reforms, thereby creating the conditions that make stable democracy more likely. As one of Robert Woodbury's research supervisors say, you can't think of something more unbelievable and offensive. You can't think of a more unbelievable and offensive story to tell a lot of secular academics. The actual story was that Robert Woodbury told me that he submitted his article. The editor of the American Political Science Review sat on it for 3 years and refused to publish it, and only submitted for publishing the day when he was supposed to, before he stepped down. But when it was published, he won 4 academic prizes. And that is the extent of the secularist prejudice against any Christian viewpoint. Thus, contrary to secularists and liberal Christians, the actual facts on the ground in the majority world demonstrate that on the whole, despite genuine mistakes made, missions and the gospel contributed greatly to the preservation of indigenous cultures and advance of human liberties, democracy, educational levels, and other means of social uplift. What then do we make of the Western guilt complex? I want to say the following. We cannot go into a detailed discussion here. But one important point that I believe, as an outsider from the West, I want to make. We have witnessed many conquests and imperial expansions throughout world history. 4,000 or 5,000 of recorded world history. Many of these have been done in the name of religion, but I'm not aware of a society that has self-critically developed a guilt complex as deep and extensive over the past mistakes as today's Western world. One can easily name various non-Western societies and nations that practice territorial expansions, oppress others in the name of religion or national interest. In which of these do we find serious wrestling with guilt? I'm not saying that those from other cultural and religious traditions are not able to develop guilt complexes. I'm saying that outside the Western culture, shaped by a Christian history, I do not see evidence of such a complex on a similar scale. The point is this: the very fact that the Western guilt complex, the very fact of the Western guilt complex may be one of the most important evidence in the enduring validity of the gospel in the post-Christian West. For it shows that the gospel has a power to shape the conscience of a culture, even when its propositional claims have been forgotten or largely rejected by that culture. Similarly, despite being abandoned by many Westerners, the gospel continues to simmer in an unquenchable manner in a society that once acknowledged Christ. What then do we conclude from this? Yes, the Western guilt should lead to repentance from presumptuous, insensitive, ethnocentric, triumphalist mission. The wrong conclusion, however, is that to suggest that we must forget about Christian missions, because such missions have lost integrity. The guilt that troubles the Western conscience over the past failures points to the moral power and enduring validity of the gospel. Without this burden of guilt, which the Spirit imparts, this world will be far more cruel, heartless, unjust, oppressive than it is. Only when our hearts and our cultures have responded to the call of Christ and experienced the work of the Spirit can such a conscience develop on a sort of scale that we find in the West. Thus, the Western guilt complex, properly understood, is also a profound call to a humble confidence and boldness in mission. I want to touch on two other topics briefly because our time moves on. The fifth issue that I want to touch on very briefly is about theological education. Now, on this issue, we in the majority world have not necessarily found the answers. We are struggling with it. But we have our critique. When it comes to theological education and training of men and women for ministry, almost all the churches in the majority world has copied the academic model used in Western Protestantism. But increasingly, this has been found wanting. Major issues are, one, the content of it is very Western. It's not, and I do not know about people in Eastern Europe, how they find it. But whether they find it, it's not really answering questions that they are wrestling with. But that one, you have to tell me. But definitely in those of us in majority world, we found the whole discussion very Western. Secondly, the methodology is very Western. And it's not necessarily helpful. For example, I often find that I say to some of my fellow teachers when we teach theology, sometimes you find that our students, by the time they graduate, they are more familiar with the critical theories of the Bible than with the Bible itself. That's what troubles me when I look at much of Western theological education. C, too much is taken for granted concerning the practical side of the pastoral ministry. We send our students, we give them academic training, we send them out for field education, but too often times the pastors who supervise the field education see seminary students as cheap labor. And when you compare that approach with the way that doctors are trained, where students are put through usually at least three clinical years, where they work side by side with doctors and specialists, you find that comparatively, our pastoral training is lagging way behind. One other crucial question remains, and that's a question that increasingly I and some other people are asking. Is the Western model centered so much on the training of the mind that character formation and a life of prayer gets neglected as a result. It is interesting that Francis Assisi, in the 12th century, whilst not against learning, is reputed to have given permission to his monks to be taught theology, quote, as long as it does not extinguish the habit of prayer. However, how many of our Protestant seminaries has got an intentional and comprehensive program for character and pastoral and spiritual formation? I don't think there are many. I don't have time to discuss this, but one of the things that in the majority world, churches have moved towards is the use of what you call theological education by extension. It comes in many, many forms. But the whole point of it is that it brings the person who's training for ministry is not spending 3-4 years full-time in a seminary, but the program is done over many years, but they're doing it while they're serving as pastors. And it's done on the field. That brings in much closer integration between the theory and the practice. But we can discuss that further, but I don't want to spend more time on it. But the whole issue of shaping pastors and ministers and their character and their prayer life, I think is a question that I don't think we are addressing very well. The last point I want to make is this. It's about persecution. How do we see persecution? You see, from the perspective of the Western Church, there are two issues related to religious persecution. First, coming from societies that are relatively free, like much of Western society, we tend to look on Christians in persecution context with a mix of concern and condescension. Poor fellows. We need to pray for them. We need to do something for them. Secondly, we need to ask whether religious freedom, as presently experienced in the West, can be taken for granted. The experience of the confessing church in Germany under Hitler, and the churches that some of you come from before 1990, will remind you that the whole issue of religious freedom remains a crucial one. Can we take it for granted? Writing at the end of the 20th century, John White notes that the freedom experienced in the West then is unparalleled, late 20th century, is unparalleled in world history. He goes on to suggest that we have now gone past the period of greatest freedom. The freedom that we have comes from Reformation's biblical view of humanity. As the biblical influence wanes, it's likely that freedom will not continue. There are signs that conditions necessary for tolerance and freedom are already being eroded. Democracy, as John White continues to put it, is a fragile flower of late bloom, likely to be withered by the scorching wind of impatient hate. I believe there's sufficient evidence, even in the media, right, to show that what John White says are deeply, profoundly prophetic. And it's a warning to biblical Christians like all of us in the West. How do we respond? I will say this. First, persecution for our faith should not take us by surprise because it's written all over in the New Testament. It is only because most of us have gotten used to a Christianity without a cross that we find any talk about Jesus' call to costly discipleship a problem. Second, a simple look at the Acts of the Apostles shows that persecution never stopped mission. In fact, it was persecution that drove mission. Third, could it be that we tend to look on persecuted Christians with a mix of concern and pity because mission for the modern church in the West have often begun from the centers of power. And because we come from the centers of power, we do not see ourselves why we should be suffering. But if you and I begin from the margins, not from the centers, you find that suffering becomes part and parcel of mission. So, I'm basing this on what you find in the book of Acts. So the above raised crucial questions for us today. First, should Christians see persecutions as setback for missions or opportunities for kingdom advance? Remember the Chinese church revival that I spoke about in the last few decades came out of state-sponsored persecution. That grassroots churches are growing in places like India and Nepal despite Hindu opposition. That many churches in the Middle East and North Africa, as under Islam, including especially Iran and others, are growing in the face of open persecution and martyrdom. Second, how do we pray for those under persecution? One Chinese leader, when asked about persecution some years ago, replied, "Don't pray that God will remove persecution, which actually refines the church. Pray that God will give us stronger backs to bear it." Thirdly, in many Western societies, wherein religious freedom is taken for granted, or where Christendom prevails, is there a real danger that a church can easily be lulled into an easy existence to which spiritual disciplines are weakened, persecution avoided, and mission dies? What about your church? In conclusion, allow me to say this, that we in the majority world has been richly and greatly blessed by the gospel, which many of your fathers in the West brought to us, often at great personal cost and sacrifice. My comments above are offered as pointers to what the Christian Western church can learn from the majority world churches and be blessed in a small way in return. My hope and my intention is that such exchanges between the West and the churches in the West and the churches in the majority world will lead to real, deep, lasting partnerships, and that together we may advance the work of God. Thank you.